Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Value Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Clare K. Rothschild. Clare Rothschild is Professor of Scripture Studies at Lewis University in the USA and Professor Extraordinary Department of Ancient Studies at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Her main research interests are Luke Acts, the Muratorian Fragment, and the Apostolic Fathers. Clare spent a year as Humboldt Fellow in Munich researching her book, Hebrews as Pseudo-Epigraphon, on the Pauline attribution of this early Christian text. Her current research focuses on the Epistle of Barnabas, on which she is preparing a commentary for the Hermeneia series. She serves as general editor of Early Christianity as well as the SBL series, Writings from the Greco-Roman World. Clare has a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Chicago. And today's discussion will be based on Clare's book titled The Muratorian Fragment. To order your copy of the book, please click on the History Value Amazon affiliate link, which is found in the description below this video and also in the pinned comment. And with that being said, welcome to the History Value Podcast, Professor Clare Rothschild.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. So what is the Muratorian Fragment?
Yeah, it's good to begin at the beginning and not assume that anybody knows what this is. So in some circles, it's very famous. It's a text that offers an ordering of scriptural books, mostly the New Testament with an exception. And it has been considered virtually since its publication an antecedent of canon lists, a type that is otherwise only known in 4th century exempla. So it would be the very first or the oldest canon list. It's fragmentary, owing to the loss of a folio at the beginning. In terms of the New Testament books, it offers most of the New Testament books, but because it begins in mid-sentence, it does not mention Matthew and it does not mention Mark, but it might begin with the conclusion of a discussion of Gospel of Mark. Then it mentions Luke and has a long discussion of the Gospel of John. It mentions the Acts of the Apostles. It takes up the Pauline epistles in an unusual order. So it begins with 1st and 2nd Corinthians, then moves to lists Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians and Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and lastly Romans. And it makes a point that Romans is 7th, which may or may not be significant. Then it mentions Paul's letters to individuals. You have also an unusual order, Philemon, Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy. Then it mentions Jude and 2 Johannine letters and John's Apocalypse. So it's missing a few, but it is, if it's the oldest list and it's coming close to our 27 books of the New Testament, then it's very important. But the significance and also the interpretation of the fragment are debated, hotly debated.
When and who discovered the fragment?
So the fragment was discovered in 1740 by a man named Ludovico Antonio Muratori. That's where we get Muratorian. And he was a very distinguished 18th century Italian historian. It's now in the Ambrosian Library, but it comes from the Bobbio Library originally, and the collection at Bobbio was transported to the Ambrosian Library eventually.
Now, I know you already mentioned earlier how many of the books the Muratorian Fragment mentions pertain to the New Testament, but rather than asking that question, I have an alternative to that.
Well,
Why do you... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I could interrupt you and say there is one thing that I didn't say that you might be wanting to know, which is which texts are omitted. So that it does not include Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 1 Johannine letter. But it's very weird because it quotes 1st John and then it includes 2 letters of John. So we don't know which letters of John should be included. Should we assume that 1st John is included because it's quoted? Or are 2nd and 3rd John included and 1st John is then omitted? The one curious thing, Jacob, about this is that those texts are in order, right? They are in the canonical order. So they're not like random texts that are excluded. They're all in the order that we find them in many catalogs. So that could mean the scribe just omitted a line. But then there's also these crazy possibilities. Should we assume that they're each selected on different bases for exclusion, or are they all selected on the same basis for exclusion? And then what would that basis be? And it's fascinating to imagine, did, for example, people think that since it was, for example, Hebrews, James, and Peter, letters from Peter, did people think that those were originally in Hebrew and not in Greek? And so this list is only the originally Greek texts. You can speculate further about the possibilities, but anyway, I just thought I'd mention that as an interesting other aspect to the list itself.
Yeah, my question was going to be somewhat similar to that. I was going to specifically ask about Matthew and Mark. Is it clear at all that the Muratorian Fragment alludes to Matthew and Mark, or is it not so clear?
It seems very likely that so there's nothing about Matthew for sure. And the very beginning of the text says in someone's presence, and it seems like maybe it was thinking about Mark. We really don't know. There's really nothing about Matthew and Mark. The names are not there. It begins after this final comment about what we think is Mark. It says the Gospel of Luke ... It was the third gospel, and then the Gospel of John is the fourth gospel. So it seems to imply that there would have been a 1 and a 2, and that those would have been Matthew and Mark.
What are the theoretical issues surrounding the fragment?
It's such a good question. I think that the primary theoretical issue is what's the genre. Because when you know the genre, you know the intention of a text. And we don't really understand what the genre of this text is. It is embedded in the codex in between or after, following the Eucharius's works, which are the genre of formula. So short sentences. And in some ways, it does look like it matches that genre. But other people have speculated that it's a commentary because it's not really a list. So the canon lists that we have from the 4th century, they're literally lists. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, letter to the Romans, and so on. So, but this is actually has some comments, like quite a few comments, as I mentioned, about the Gospel of John. So it's not really a list. And another name for a list is a catalog. So that's kind of probably off the table. It's not really a commentary because it doesn't say a lot about the text that it mentions. It just says a very little. So then, thirdly, we've thought, is it a preface? And that's where we can get to some of the very early external citations of the fragment's material and start to talk about whether the genre of those citations would imply something about the fragment's genre.
Can you tell us a bit about the Latinity of the Muratorian Fragment, and did a Greek text exist or a Latin archetype that predates the surviving text?
Yeah. I chuckle because I love these questions. So the Latin text probably represents a 5th century exemplar. Most people think that. There are some important debates, even some new debates coming up, not yet published, but coming up about various lexemes. But at the moment, 5th century, I would say 5th century makes sense. Now, does that 5th century Latin represent an updated version of a prior Latin text? Maybe. Does it represent a translation of a Greek text? Scholars are divided. So it might. Part of the problem is the material in the Muratorian Fragment is fairly conventional to prologue material and discussions of the New Testament in general. And so it's kind of hard to say, the text itself is kind of endemic. The individual pieces of it are endemic, and so hard to locate them in time. There are a few red herring lexemes, but basically it's difficult to say. Now, based on errors in spelling choices and abbreviation marks, I've hypothesized that it was copied, sorry, from an abbreviated exemplar, and that the copyist of our actual manuscript had difficulty expanding. Now, this might not say a ton about the date or whether we had, it would say that we had a prior Latin text, but it could be contemporaneous practically with the actual manuscript that we have. But that if that exemplar was abbreviated, it might tell us something about the genre, because usually liturgical texts were abbreviated. This is work I haven't done yet that, yeah, still needs to be done.
What is the earliest known external attestation of the Muratorian Fragment?
Well, also kind of debated, but so for a while, most people thought it was a work, a tractate on the Gospel of Matthew by the Bishop of Aquileia in the late 4th and early 5th century, named Chromatius. But there are also these, I think you already know about them, but there are also these prologues that are nicknamed the Benedictine prologues for their location in a Benedictine monastery in Italy, and those probably attest the first use of a deployment of the Muratorian fragment as a source, and those may be dated to around the time of the early 5th century as well. So you could argue Chromatius or maybe the Benedictine prologue, of which we have 5 examples now.
What do we know about the parallels between the Muratorian Fragment and the Benedictine prologues?
Yeah. So the Benedictine prologues we have 5 examples now. We used to have only 4, but there was a new one was just discovered. And the Benedictine prologue has 24 lines in common with the Muratorian fragment. To make it simple, if you take the Benedictine prologue and you divide it into 6 pieces, 4 of those pieces have parallels with the Muratorian fragment and 2 do not. And the ones that have parallels with the Muratorian fragment are not in the order that they are found in the fragment, which means if the author of the Benedictine prologue was copying from the Muratorian fragment, that he did not regard its various pieces that they necessarily needed to be taken in order. In other words, they were considered movable elements. Or maybe the author had a version of the Muratorian fragment that was in a different order from ours. And this evidence is kind of exciting to me. What happened is when my monograph came out, even before I'd seen the written copy, the print published copy, somebody contacted me, a guy named Paul Needham. He's actually a specialist on the Gutenberg Bible and was a longtime librarian, Shida librarian at Princeton University. He was reading the Manfred Bible, which is about from the middle of the 13th century, saw a prologue in there to 1 Corinthians, I believe, that he didn't recognize. And he put it into Google search and my book came up, even though I hadn't even seen my book yet, but the publisher had put portions of it online anyway, made it searchable. He sent me the material and I evaluated it in collaboration with a friend of mine named Jeremy Thompson, who's a medievalist. And we recognized it as another witness to the Benedictine prologue. And so we published about 6 or 9 months after the publication of the volume that we're talking about on this discussion here, we published another volume, and that is a new collation and new presentation of the Benedictine prologue that takes into account this 5th witness, which is kind of exciting.
What are the connections between the Anti-Marcionite prologues, Monarchian prologues, and Chromatius with the Muratorian fragment?
So I mentioned Chromatius before. There are some lines that have verbatim representation of Muratorian fragment in Chromatius's tractate on Matthew, but the Anti-Marcionite and the Monarchian prologue. So the Anti-Marcionite prologues are prologues that came before Paul's letters in the presentation in a Bible, right? So in a Bible, you have Paul's letters. Before each one of Paul's letters, you have these short prologues, and then you can also collect the prologues all into one. And so those are the anti-Marcionite prologues. And then the monarchian prologues are prologues to the Gospels. And both of these groups of prologues have things in common with the presentation in the Muratorian Fragment. There is no smoking gun or slam dunk parallel, but there are some pretty close parallels. But if you look at these prologue materials, they're all kind of common. They're all kind of similar. So you have basically the prologues were written to steer readers in directions and give them, like initial help, just like prologues in Bibles today. They're trying to give you the occasion, maybe where the letter is written, and its occasion, and sometimes a little bit more, maybe who the opponents were in the letter. And so, since that's always often going to be the same across whoever wrote the prologue, then you get many parallels across prologue literature, and then the Muratorian Fragment looks kind of like prologue material strung together into one short discussion of all of the books of the New Testament, so with the exception of 5. But anyway, so that's basically what's going on with that material. Yes, we do see parallels, that is relevant parallel literature, but nothing that is that shows that that the fragment utilized them, or they utilized the fragment as a source.
When does the Muratorian Fragment date?
Okay, so that's the, what do they say, $6 million question, $6 million question, or whatever it is. Yeah, that's the most important question that everybody wants to know. And it dates it internally. It appears to date itself to the mid-2nd century, to the pontificate of Pope Pius I. Now, his dates are debated, but range from 142 to 146 on one hand, and 157 to 161 on another hand. The way that the fragment argues this is through something that, or situates itself in time, is through something that's known as the fraternity legend, which unfortunately is a fallacious account of the composition of the Shepherd of Hermas. So you see, this gets kind of complicated. But basically, the fragmentist says that recently, even in our own times, nuperime temporibus nostris in Latin, in the line 74, the author says that recently in our own times, the Shepherd of Hermas was written by somebody who was the brother, hence the fraternity legend, the brother of Pope Pius in Rome. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with this legend. That's why it's called a legend. First of all, it only crops up in the 4th century, other than the fragment, which is we haven't dated. Next of all, it dates the shepherd too early. And so we're not quite sure why it would do that. And also, it names the author of the fragment as pastor, which, I mean, is Hermas, which is a Greek name, and it names that the author of and the brother is Pius. So you have a Latin name and a Greek name for brothers, which seems unlikely. And then you also have Hermas, who's literate, but also very humble, that he would have had a brother who was the Bishop of Rome. There are quite a number of, and it's dating basically the shepherd later than we would like it in order to not include it in the canon. So there are just a number of aspects of this legend that make it really difficult. But so it seems to date itself to the long and short 2nd century, but it may not be doing that. I have proposed that the word tempus here might refer to circumstances, not times, and the author might be denoting the city of Rome. So he's saying that Shepherd of Hermas was written even in our own circumstances here in Rome, rather than in our own times. And then the author has to be at the time of Pope Pius. So all of that to say, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there was a movement kind of against this idea that the fragment was written in the 2nd century, trying to place the fragment in the 4th century. And this work was begun by a man named Albert Sundberg, and then was continued by his student, or is sort of a follower of this ideas, who's a man named Jeff Hahnemann. And they want to place it in the 4th century. And then there was this big divide, 2nd century or 4th century. And then I've tried to open the question up again with this idea that maybe tempus means the circumstances of Rome. I've even posited the possibility that the author just wanted you to think he was in the 2nd century, even though he was in the 4th century. Although I don't really side with that argument now. I did think about it at one time, and I do think it's still a valid possibility. So anyway, we're not really sure. I'm leaning now heavily on the side of the 4th century or early 5th century. And I think, I don't want to make too much of my book, but in a recent conference that we had in Strasbourg, there did seem to be a growing, I would say, maybe not, I don't want to overstate it, but anyway, yeah, seems to be a growing consensus that maybe a later date is correct.
So with that in mind, it seems to situate itself in the 2nd century, and that I suppose would be the earliest possible date. What is the latest possible date for the
Well,
fragment?
that's great, but the latest possible date is the first time it's attested, and we kind of talked about that, which would be Chromatius, which would be the 4th century, or maybe the antiquem has to be the Benedictine Prologue, which is going to be the 5th century. So we definitely are finding ourselves between probably 160 or 180 for a round number, and 380, something like that. Those are probably realistic. Now there is a thesis that situates in between those two dates too, but
What other text does the Muratorian Fragment mention?
so it's fascinating. It mentions Laodiceans, a letter to the Laodiceans, and also a letter to the Alexandrians. It says both are spurious. We don't know which Laodiceans it's talking about, whether it was in Latin or in Greek. And then the Alexandrians, we have no idea what that means. Some people have thought, well, was it a reference to Hebrews? Since Hebrews is missing. Most people don't think that's the case. But I mean, somebody needs to go to the desert and start digging and find out what this really means, the letter to the Alexandrians. Then it also mentions wisdom, which presumably refers to the wisdom of Solomon. And as I said, it mentions the shepherd of Hermas. It mentions Peter's apocalypse. So at the end of the Muratorian Fragment, it says John's apocalypse, Peter's apocalypse, and the shepherd of Hermas. So those are 3 apocalypses. So it does include those 3. There is some idea that nobody's going to be talking about Peter's apocalypse by the 4th century. The cachet around that text was prior to that, but don't know exactly about that, whether we can use the reference to Peter's apocalypse to date the text. And then finally, it mentions, heretical works. It says anything written by, and then this passage is corrupt, so we're not really sure what it says, but Arsenus, something like that. Valentinus, we know who that is. Miltiades, and then Basilides. And it says that there was a psalm book written for Marcion. So those are other unusual. I have actually proposed a different reading of this heresy catalog. Then you could say that my reconstruction is incorrect, but this is a problematic. At the conference that I mentioned that I was at recently, it was proposed that when you speak about heretics, you act like, they're all, unreliable, and I don't even remember their names. They're all like names I don't remember, and then you just kind of spout them off, and you aren't very precise about them. And that's sort of a deliberate way to put them down. To denigrate sort of the heretics. And so that's why the names are corrupted. It's kind of a nice theory. But anyway, so yeah, those are the ones that are mentioned in addition to the texts of the New Testament.
What are the various theories concerning the authorship of the fragment?
Well, so most people just say, look, it's anonymous. And then they situate it in the East in the 4th century, like Sundberg and Hahnemann, or it's in the West, and then leave it anonymous. Not so long ago, though, somebody named J.J. Armstrong, he argued that it was written by Victorinus of Pettau, who was an ecclesiastical Christian writer flourishing around the end of the 3rd century and was martyred. And, I don't believe this argument is correct, but he makes many good points. And the material that we're talking about that winds itself up in the fragment does seem to have things in common with Victorinus. And so it may be that what I'm currently thinking is that Victorinus had some material that the fragmentist picked up. And so that's why you see those resonances. I myself have argued that the fragment belongs in the ambit of the author known as Ambrosiaster. And that's almost kind of like a little bit humorous, because Ambrosiaster is means somebody that means pseudo Ambrose, right? So it means we don't know who it is. It's somebody that used the Ambrose's name, but wasn't actually Ambrose. So in other words, more anonymity. It's like a form of pseudonymity that takes, like replaces our current thesis about anonymity. But there are a number of correspondences with the writings of Ambrosiaster and the time and place, like especially northern Italy of the mid to late 4th century. So, and we don't know, people are working very hard on Ambrosiaster at the moment. There's a woman named Marie Pierre Bussière who is almost ready to publish a new version of the Quaestiones. And from that, we might see additional parallels with the fragment, or might not, but there might be more there. But anyway, so I have placed the fragment in the oeuvre, in Ambrosiaster's ambit, not necessarily his oeuvre. I will say one thing I find very interesting is that the Muratorian Codex, so the book that the Muratorian fragment is in, the fragments pages 10 and 11 of that book has 3 major works. The 2 works I mentioned of Eucharius, and then one major work of John Chrysostom, which is his letter to Theodore, which itself is interesting. But anyway, in between those 3 works are shorter works. So I have imagined that maybe that those 3 works were placed in the codex and with blank pages in between. And then those blank pages in between that were left by the scribe to make sure you had enough room, obviously, to fit the longer texts, were filled in subsequently. Now, this is the really interesting thing to me, is that there are five of those texts. 3 of them are written by Ambrosiaster. And the other 2, one of them has been speculated was written by Ambrosiaster, and the other one's the fragment. So it does kind of fit in the codex, at least as though the person who included it in that codex saw it in the ambit of Ambrosiaster.
Now, my final question, what would you say is perhaps not the smoking gun, but the closest thing to a smoking gun that you can think of that really causes you to lean towards dating the Muratorian fragment to the late 4th century, early 5th century area?
Yeah, it's that we have no canon lists in before the 4th century, right? So the famous one is from Athanasius in 367 or so, and that's when lists became popular, right? That was when the New Testament list genre blossomed. And so if we have one that's from 160, that'd be really cool, but it seems like too good to be true. So that's my smoking gun. But that's been known for a long time. People simply thought, look, the text dates itself to the 2nd century, so it has to be there. And I'm like, I don't know. Too many of of the aspects within the text, the traditions that it copies, well, some of them are very hard to date, but some of them really suggest they're from the 4th century earliest. So I think maybe we've misread that new Perry-made temporibus nostris line or something. It's a very challenging, but I find a exciting and enjoyable problem.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Claire Rothschild.
Yeah, thanks for having me very much. And one of my favorite things to talk about. So
Thank you for joining me. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.